USAID has been dissolved. As at the 2nd of February, the website of USAID was shut down, to show you how big this actually is. It's beyond just Nigeria. Now, what exactly are the allegations against, the allegations against USAID funding in Nigeria? There's so many. It goes beyond just the fact that saying they were sponsoring terrorism, as the words used in that report, Boko Haram. If one digs deeper, you'll see that there's been several allegations. Even, what's his name, David Hundeyi, journalist, investigative journalist, also put out some reports on his Twitter handle, or his X handle. So what exactly are the allegations that we're seeing here about USAID funding in Nigeria?
Well, Bernard, it goes on and on and on, honestly. And, the more you think about these things, it somewhat makes it even more controversial and even more difficult to understand. But talking about the allegations, so during an inaugural hearing of the Subcommittee on Delivering Government Efficiency on the 13th of February, Congressman Perry had claimed that American taxpayers' money, or part of USAID's $697 million budget, was unintentionally being used to fund ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist training camps. Of course, you know that this would snowball into a lot of reactions and counter-reactions from different quarters and different parts of the world, owing, to the level of work that USAID does. Now, for Nigeria, on the floor of the National Assembly, the Senate to be precise, it was no surprise when we saw the likes of Senator Ali Udumi from Borno South. Now, if you're conversant with Borno South, you would know that that senatorial district houses, local governments like Goza, Chibok, and a host of them, Dongbua, Askira Oba. Some of these local governments are not new, especially considering the fact that they've been on the news for different reasons, especially around insurgency. You remember the Chibok incident of 2014, how many girls were abducted? The situation is not too different in Biu. It's not too different in Dongbua, where we had over the previous years issues of explosions, activities of insurgents, and how it has, worsened the security situation in Borno State. So, of course, it was no surprise when we saw Senator Ali Ndume rise to say, if this allegation should hold any water, then it is imperative upon the Senate, or the Nigerian Senate, to investigate it. Because, the trauma that Nigerians, thousands, if not millions of Nigerians have faced because of the issue of Boko Haram is enough reason why the Senate should investigate. Hence the reason why he is insisting that, the National Security Advisor, the Director General of the Department of State Services, as well as the Director General of the National Intelligence Agency, should appear before the Senate and brief them behind closed doors, of course, considering the sensitivity of matters like this, but give the Senate an update of the situation. Is this allegation true? If not, what are we doing to curtail, if not prevent such, amount of, I do not want to call it fake news, but preventing such incidents from escalating and, painting the wrong narrative in the media and, of course, in the global space?
Okay, so for the ordinary man, because a lot of times when we talk about some of these things, especially when they hear US, they think that it has nothing to do with them. But basically, the USAID, or the United States Agency for International Development, performs so many functions, including administrating money for humanitarian aid overseas, extending assistance to countries recovering from disaster or countries trying to escape poverty, which Nigeria falls under, and engaging in democratic reforms. So that goes to tell you how important this fund is. And from my experience and the things that we've seen and heard in this country, no amount of money is a drop in the ocean. It goes a long way to helping, the people who are starving, who are, displaced by one disaster or man-made disaster or the other. So how dangerous is it that these funds are allegedly not used for the actual causes that they're mapped out for?
Well, I hope I'm able to provide as much insight as possible, considering the fact that I'm not a security expert. But bearing in mind that if you walk into any primary health care center in Nigeria, let's start from there before we even escalate, to major health facilities and the likes, you would see banners. Some of these banners carry USAID from the American people. This sort of paints a picture, of how relevant and important the activities of the USAID is in countries, developing countries such as Nigeria and the likes. Now, for us to have an allegation pointing that there might be either intentional or unintentional, funds from this donor agency or aid agency, as the case may be, sponsoring activities, of the likes of Boko Haram. It's quite grave, bearing in mind that agencies such as this would usually have, access to the nooks and crannies of all functions of government, if you would permit me to use that word. So one could not imagine the level of access, that an agency such as USAID could have in a government such as that of Nigeria, considering the importance of the kind of work, it does. Now, if considering all of this, you now see how one needs to be careful, to consider this allegation and why it is very, very important for the Senate to invite these chiefs of the intelligence agencies and the national security advisors to come and explain. Because sitting down to think of it is literally unfathomable. You literally cannot think about how bad it can go if the allegations are true, of course. And, if not, something has to be done to ensure that this doesn't escalate into a major misinformation crisis.
And speaking of how bad it can go, honestly, I know that we're concentrating on Nigeria here, but it goes beyond just Nigeria. Now, Blessings was reading out, some of the things that USAID does, and you were trying to explain that. Now, it goes beyond just healthcare. You said you go into some clinics, even some rural areas, right? You get to see banners of USAID and the works they do. Now, USAID is not just in healthcare. I'd just like to put it into perspective here. We have USAID works in agriculture and food security. We have in democracy, human rights and governance. We have in economic growth and trade. We have in education. We have in global health, water and sanitation. They also work in crisis and conflict regions. If you put all this together, this covers so many countries across Africa, so many countries across some parts of Southeast Asia, and in some places in South America as well. So you see how far it has spread. But for the purpose of this conversation, we're sticking to Nigeria. Now, if it does truly happen that funds from USAID has gone into sponsorship of terrorism and other things, it's just a ticking time bomb that's waiting to explode across the globe, not just in Nigeria. But going forward now, I just want to pick your brain a little bit, Sagir. Now, what impact do you think that this controversy could have on Nigeria's relationship with not just USAID, but also with America as a country, and other international donors that help Nigeria?
Oh, great question, Bernard. But then, perhaps a diplomat would be in the best position to provide comprehensively the kind of impact that this would have if it should hold any water. Because, you mentioned a lot of the activities and the programs that the USAID, is currently implementing in countries like Nigeria and other developing countries, be it within Africa or outside of Africa.
Yeah.
Now, this then reiterates the question that the Senate president asked. If any of this is true, then why is the USAID being granted, free leave and access in countries like Nigeria? Why? Because if it happens, it means that, bear in mind that this is not the first time that allegations, bordering around international non-governmental organizations sponsoring in one way or the other the activities of terrorist or insurgent groups has come out. But I think this is the first time in a really long time that we've seen the likes of a US congressman in that caliber come out to say, oh, this is going on and we need to let the American people know that this is what has been going on with their taxpayers' money. Then coming back to Nigeria, I really do not know how to explain I really do not know how to explain how much of a serious security risk and the implications of it that might come out of this allegation if it should hold any water. But I do know that until the Senate has listened to the DSSDG, to the NIADG, to the National Security Advisor, we might need to wait to hear the outcome of that development before we can make any conclusive statements.
Okay, so, well, I think what's left to ask now is how far do you think this will stretch? What level of investigation do you think will go into this? And what are we expecting to see in the coming days from your opinion?
Well, in my opinion, I expect that those who have been invited to answer to the Senate will have to come before the Senate to answer those questions. Now, whatever the outcome of that meeting is, we would see hopefully within the next week or maybe upper week or whenever they receive the letter and they, grace themselves before the Senate. But what will most likely happen is an outcome and a conclusive statement stating that, oh, this is true or this is not true, and Nigerians should not, panic over the development. Because, of course, it's a reason for panic when you hear the likes of Boko Haram being funded or sponsored in part by USAID funding. It simply tells you, that truly and really, the organization is really an international terrorist organization if it should draw that kind of funding. So my own hope is this allegation is basically what it is, an allegation, and it can be resolved quickly in the interest of Nigerians and, of course, in the interest of Nigerian security.
Truly, and I think I'll just add to that, Blessings, like the question you just asked him. I think it's going to take us down a serious rabbit hole, because there are so many organizations. This whole thing is intertwined. There are so many agencies, so many organizations that are tied to the USAID, different countries, as you mentioned earlier. As a matter of fact, like you did mention, you go to some places, you see the banners of USAID. The sad part again is a lot of people are losing their jobs to start with, right? In America, away from America, in Nigeria, there are so many NGOs here in Nigeria, particularly health organizations, NGOs. I know a couple, a couple of those NGOs. I know people who work with them. I know some of the good work that they have been doing. Now, whether or not the USAID has been sponsoring terrorism, right? I know a lot of good work that some of these organizations have been doing. I know a lot of research work that some of them have been doing, particularly in northern Nigeria. It will surprise you to know, because some of these organizations are familiar names, right? I'm not going to mention any, but a good number of them are familiar names. The sad part now is, with this funding that has been cut off, some people are going to lose their jobs. A lot of people are going to lose their jobs. Some of these research agencies would find it difficult to continue their work because their funding comes from here. I was on Instagram, but there's something that interested me. A lady from Ghana was on our Instagram page and said, maybe this is a wake-up call for African countries to now start looking inwards for their own development in terms of agriculture, in terms of water resources, in terms of health, in terms of particularly, basic health care, which is some of the things that they used to get from USAID funding. Also, the lady also said on Instagram then that there's a possibility that there's been a lot of corruption from USAID funding, where some of these funds come into the African countries, and then instead of it going to what it was meant for, the way it happens in African countries, right? Some leaders here and there would embezzle some parts, and then the other part goes here and there. So, this is just answering the question Blessings asked you. I don't see the end anywhere close right now. It's a rabbit hole that we would rather have not gone down. Yeah. But, if things have to be shaken up, then I guess it is what it is.
I think, okay, go ahead. You want to say something?
I also would like to add that I think attention is being moved away from what's most important here, and which is the fact that millions and millions of Nigerians who initially do not have access, to proper healthcare facilities and treatment might lose that. I mean, we know what the likes of the USAID have been doing in terms of the provision of antiretroviral drugs, for people and persons living with HIV and AIDS. And when funding such as this, and mind you, Nigeria benefits around $600 million or so, from USAID funding in part. So you should imagine the kind of implications that will come with this funding being cut off. Now, this is, of course, away from the allegation of sponsoring Boko Haram or not sponsoring Boko Haram. I feel that while the intelligence agencies and the national security advisors are left to do their jobs in terms of investigation, it is also very important for the Nigerian government to do as much as it can to fill in the loops that the USAID funding cut is going to create. I do not personally feel like around $200 million is enough to fill that gap. So this is also my own call to the government that while this has been, provided in the 2025 appropriation bill, there is also need to increase this funding to ensure that young parents, women and children particularly have access to the kind of healthcare services that they need, especially in rural communities, hard-to-reach communities that have people living some below the poverty line.
So I would say very much so, Sagir, that you're right in saying that we have an impending health crisis in our hands because of, you know, the things that we could and have been doing with the USAID funding that has been coming. And truthfully, this HIV/AIDS issue is a big one because the retroviral drugs that we have been using for the longest time is what has been, what I say, quelling the effects. Because I know that there was a time that there was a scare, you know, AIDS scare around the world. And I think then the agencies took it as a responsibility, you know, singing songs about it, AIDS not a show for face and things like that. So imagine what the dangers will be if these funds are cut off. But that would also lead me to saying that we have been for the longest time so heavily reliant on international and external intervention.
Exactly.
And that has led to complacency on our own part. Everything, almost everything right now, we are dependent on external intervention. This is the same issue that we had with COVID-19. This is the same issue we're having with climate change crisis. In fact, it was so big an issue that at the, you know, 2 last COP summits, Africans were blaming external bodies that said they were going to help and said eventually they can't help anymore. Why is it that we cannot?
This should be a conversation for another time.
Honestly,
you know, I was going to say that.
Honestly, but I would also say that this is a wake-up call for us because another issue here is the issue of lack of proper documentation, hence lack of accountability that we have been running away from for the longest time. And we see it you know, crippling our economy little by little. The fact that we do not have proper documentation of what these funds are used for, these accusations should not even hold water if the funds and the, you know, the usage of it are properly documented. So these are issues that we need to look into. And like you said, some of these conversations are conversations for another day. But thank you so much for joining us and, you know, sharing your own opinion on this. It's a big issue and we'll continue to, you know, look into it. Hopefully it doesn't negatively affect us as a country as much. That's just all I can say.
All right, definitely. Thank you so much.